We're going to pick up today in Ephesians. We've been walking through Ephesians these last 3 weeks, and we're going to continue on today. Ephesians 4. You learned Christ. My assumption is that you have paid careful attention to him, been well instructed in the truth precisely as we have seen it in Jesus. Since then, we do not have the excuse of ignorance. Everything, and I do mean everything, connected with that old way of life has got to go. It's rotten through and through. Get rid of it, and then take on an entirely new way of life, a God-fashioned life, a life renewed from the inside and working itself into your conduct as God accurately reproduces his character in you. What this adds up to then is this: no more lies, no more pretense. Tell your neighbor the truth. In Christ's body, we're all connected to each other, after all. When you lie to others, you end up lying to yourself. What would it look like if we told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to our neighbors? It's interesting that the word used here, translated as neighbors, is the same exact word that is used in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which casts neighbors as what? Pretty much everybody with whom we come into contact, even those who would be seen as other. So what would it look like if we told our neighbors the truth? What would it look like in a world where facts seem to be up for debate? What would speaking truthfully to our neighbor look like if it included a full and honest answer as to why your church welcomes all? Or why your yard sign also is in Spanish and Arabic as well as English? Or why you go the extra mile to be nice to that neighbor who lives over there, who is so mean and nasty all the time? What if you were truthful and you said, it was because I learned Christ? And not just because I was trying to be nice, or not just because I liked the politics of that particular issue, but instead because I was trying to follow Jesus. I don't know how your neighbor would react, but in my neighborhood, that would be something to talk about. Now, we might blame Twitter and social media, but giving people something to talk about is ages old, as politicians, preachers, and prophets have shown. As they say, there is no such thing as bad publicity. Give the people something to talk about, and talk about it, they will. And why not? Jesus certainly did his share of sharing the good news, going from town to town, healing people, preaching about this kingdom of God that would level the playing field, a reign in which the poor would be elevated and the powerful would be made low, where the blind would see again, where everybody would have access, full access to God, even those wretched outsiders. Jesus and his message were something to talk about. But evangelism? Now that is something we do not want to talk about. The word alone can induce a wave of fear, shame, even disgust for some of us. Many of us were taught that we should reach out to our friends and share the good news, the gospel. But then something was off. Something didn't seem quite right in this gospel of love, because many of us were taught that we need to reach out to our friends to save them from the fires of hell. Now, why an all-powerful, all-loving God needed to kill his own son to settle some unnamed score with the devil, or why those in far-flung corners of the world were going to burn in an eternal lake of fire, those are questions better not asked. Even in ministries to the homeless and in mission sites around the world, we've seen basic human rights like food and shelter withheld in the name of evangelism. I know you're hungry and need a place to lay your head, but the soup is served after the sermon, sir. Please have a seat. Somehow, they missed how the feeding of the 5,000 went. Those forms of evangelism are not only biblically and theologically misguided, they aren't the way Jesus did it. They are something to talk about, but for bad reasons. Here's the however. However, we make a mistake if we throw evangelism out entirely because some, even many, have linked it with threatening theology and coerced conversions. Let me explain. Let me explain by just breaking down the word itself. The Greek noun, now brace yourselves. I'm going to go all John David Bowman on you here. For those of you who don't know John David, he's our resident Greek scholar right up here. I'm going to go John David Bowman. The Greek noun, euangelion, simply means good news. In Old English, the word that we've inherited is gospel. That's the word we use. And so we have the good newses, if you will, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, evangelism is a verb form of that word, as in to bring the good news. Now that begs the question, what exactly is this good news? I'm guessing you could ask 10 different people and get 10 different answers. So bear with me as we take a lightning fast tour of good news and bringing the good news in the good newses themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark, the first written gospel, starts with the very first phrase, quote, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The implication here is that the whole story, the rest of the story that follows, is the good news in its entirety. But that's not the only time the author uses it. It comes just a few verses later, as in to believe the good news. That Greek word is pisteo. We've talked about that before. Have full trust in this good news. Put your life behind this good news. Mark also seems to place an emphasis on the universality of this good news. Quotes here, it's for all nations, it's for the whole world, it's for all of creation, it's for everywhere. And Mark uses it when discussing the self-sacrificial nature of Jesus' message, as in losing one's life for the sake of the good news. Yes, it's the same word used by Mark and Matthew that went with the act of extravagant love of an unnamed woman who poured out fragrant oil to anoint him as he traveled to Jerusalem for his last days. Quoted there, truly I tell you, wherever this good news is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. The good news is love. Moving ahead to Luke, a familiar quote. Jesus goes into the temple and he takes out a scroll and he reads from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news. To whom? The poor. Proclaim reliefs to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. Let the oppressed go free and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jubilee, radical redistribution of wealth. Interestingly, in the Gospel of John, probably the most often quoted gospel when it comes to evangelism, guess how many times the word appears there? 0. Thanks for bearing with me there on that quick tour. Note that we heard nothing about lakes of fire, nothing about fiery graves. Jesus and the gospel writers, speaking to desperate, abused, and occupied people. For them, the good news was not an afterlife insurance policy. It was real. It was here. It was now. It was commitment to the most vulnerable. It was commitment to the universality of Jesus' message. It was inclusive of healing, self-sacrifice, justice. That is the good news. And it was and is something to talk about. With that background of the good news, here's something to talk about at your tables in a few minutes. What is the best news? As you think about it, what is the best news in Jesus' good news? As you think about Jesus' good news, all those things that I just mentioned, what is the best news? Is it the proclamation of God's loving reign? Is it that the world will bend towards justice for the most vulnerable? Is it that self-sacrifice and courage and love are celebrated over power and self-serving actions? What is the best news in that? And here's the follow-up question to that. It's even maybe a little harder, a little more confrontational. Why bother sharing it? I think it's a fair question. Okay, Pastor Greg, so evangelism is sharing the good news of Jesus, and maybe that's not as bad as I thought it was, but still, it's uncomfortable. And besides, this congregation's bills are paid, pews are pretty full. Why bother sharing the good news that we have found here? And besides, who am I to be telling other people what they ought to think, where they ought to go, where they ought to spend a Sunday morning? Stories told of a girl who was waiting for her father to come out of the grocery store. And as she was waiting, a woman walked up to her and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the post office is? I'm new in town." The girl points. She said, "Oh, yeah, sure, it's just over this hill. You go down the hill, then it'll be on your right." The woman said, "Thank you very much. It's very nice of you. Now, I have something I want to share with you." She said, "If I'm new in town, I'm a new pastor, so if you come to my church on Sunday, here's the address, I will show you how to get to heaven." To which the girl responds, "Oh, come on, you don't even know where the post office is." Point taken. Who are we to be giving directions about where to find God? I understand that. And the most concise way I can answer that question is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter." Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Now, I don't think this minister, this reverend, this pastor of the good news, as he was necessarily talking about evangelism here, but he sure was talking about the gospel, the good news. We have something to talk about. What we say and what we do, it matters. It matters through our words, it matters through our actions, probably best as a combination of both, by the manner of our living, as the back of the bulletin says. A combination of both. Incidentally, that's a lot how Jesus did it. The other thing I would say is that you do realize that this is a special place. You do realize that all that stuff about the good news may not be what other people are hearing around town this morning, or in the county, or in the state. This is a place where the good news really is the good news, where we share that good news, where we encourage and challenge one another towards what really matters. It's a place where we care about one another. It's a place where Jesus' message of inclusion is very real. We strive to practice that inclusion. It's a place of peace in a nation and world that believe that war and violence are what saves, instead of Jesus and his nonviolent way of justice. Another thing we strive to practice. It's a place where, in the tradition of the Good Samaritan, we reach out to our neighbor no matter their religious or national background. A place where the stranger and refugee are not detained, but rather cared for. It's a place where service is a way of life. It's a place where you don't have to check your brain at the door, a place where we take the Bible seriously enough not to be spoon-fed, overly simplified literalism. It's a place where Jesus and his message matter. And so do you. Now that is something to talk about.